Good day. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines, brought to you by the Post and Courier. I'm Glenn Smith. I'm the editor of the newspaper's Watchdog and Public Service team. And with me today are investigative reporters Avery Wilks and Thad Moore, and quick response reporter Jocelyn Grzeszczak. We're here today to talk about Alex Murdaugh's upcoming murder trial. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the event is being recorded today, and we will be sending out a video after the event with contact info in case anyone has more questions. I also want to encourage everyone to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Before we get started as well, I want to plug the Murdaugh landing page we have. If you want to get caught up on the case, look at past articles and breaking news, you can go to postandcourier.com/Murdaugh. Also, a good resource heading into the trial is to check out our weekly podcast, Understand Murdaugh, which is available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Okay, it's been 19 months since prominent Hampton attorney Alex Murdaugh called police telling them that his wife and son had been shot to death at the family's sprawling Colleton County hunting estate. The time since, Murdaugh's life has unraveled in a very public and spectacular way. He's been indicted in a failed suicide plot, treated for a raging drug habit, and tied to a string of financial crimes that siphoned nearly $9 million from his former law firm and clients. And that's not to mention the web of civil lawsuits and associated criminal investigations that has sprung up around the once prominent attorney. The final blow came this past summer when he was formally charged with killing his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. Allegations that he adamantly denies. Those allegations are going to play out in a high-stakes trial that begins this coming Monday, January 23rd, in the small city of Walterboro, which is the county seat of Colleton County. Media from across the nation are expected to arrive in attendance, and for what some are calling the trial of the century in South Carolina. Today, we're sitting down with the team who will be covering this trial gavel to gavel over what is expected to be perhaps 3 weeks or more of testimony. We will be discussing where things stand with the case, including the evidence against Murdaugh, his alleged motive, and the legal strategies at play. Okay, Avery, we're going to start with you today. We have veteran attorneys on both sides here, and they've been slugging it out for months over what the jury will hear and consider. Tell us a little bit about the state's theory of the case and what they have put forth as the motive for the killings.
Yeah, so essentially the state believes and has alleged that Alex Murdaugh killed his wife and son in June 2021 in a desperate and frantic attempt to distract and delay from a pair of inquiries that were about to expose his myriad financial crimes and lead to his personal ruin. Obviously, since the slayings in June 2021, there have been a rolling series of indictments that together allege that Murdaugh stole nearly $9 million from his legal clients and their settlements, his law partners, as well as others who trusted him, such as the family of his late housekeeper. And all of that potentially was going to be exposed in the weeks after the slayings ultimately were committed. And so there were inquiries into Murdaugh's finances by his law firm, as well as in a civil case regarding the 2019 boat crash. And so essentially, state investigators and prosecutors allege that Murdaugh killed his wife and son in order to buy himself time to try to cover up and try to, as well, portray himself as a victim of this unspeakable tragedy, and to get people to stop asking questions that he potentially recognized were going to lead to his personal unraveling. Of course, Murdaugh's defense attorneys have claimed that is illogical and implausible theory. They're going to be taking a lot of shots at that during the upcoming trial. And essentially, they say it makes no sense to commit a murder in order to prevent your financial crimes from coming out. As far as what the state has against Murdaugh, there has been a lot of discussion about that in pretrial motions. The state has claimed they have a mountain of evidence that all points back to Murdaugh and only Murdaugh in these slayings. We've heard about GPS evidence, about a video found on Paul Murdaugh's phone, about blood spatter evidence, all of which the state seems to believe places Murdaugh at the scene either shortly before or during the commission of these crimes. And of course, we've seen Murdaugh's defense attorneys try to take shots at that evidence in pretrial filings and try to exclude pieces of evidence that could be damning or could lead a jury to believe that their client actually committed these slayings. And a lot of those fights about what evidence is introduced and what evidence is excluded are still ongoing and probably won't be settled until after jury selection and the actual beginning of this trial.
Yeah, there's some pretty big pieces of evidence there too, like the blood spatter on the shirt. That, again, heading into trial, that's a key piece of physical evidence in a largely circumstantial case. Correct?
Exactly. The blood spatter is one of the most hotly debated issues, going on right now. I mean, the Murdaugh's defense team just yesterday submitted a 63-page motion to try to exclude that evidence and that analysis from being mentioned at trial. Basically their theory is that, and what they've put in court filings is that state investigators misled the analyst who purportedly found blood spatter on Alex Murdaugh's shirt. And of course, blood spatter is important because it would, if a person has droplets of blood, like stains from those droplets on their shirt, that means that they were either holding the gun or very close to the gun as it went off and killed the people that caused that blood to be discharged into the air. So it was portrayed as this major piece of damning evidence against Murdaugh. And, essentially, Murdaugh's defense attorneys say that it's this big fraud, that Murdaugh's shirt actually tested negative for human blood, but the state investigators didn't tell the forensic analyst that. And the forensic analyst analyzed the shirt and initially did not find blood spatter. But then after SLED, badgered him for a couple of months, he revised his opinion and found more than 100 stains of blood spatter. So they're trying to get all of that thrown out. And that will, again, be one of those things that comes up in the pretrial motions, and Judge Newman, whatever decision he reaches on that, is going to have a major impact at trial. The other major outstanding thing that's left to be resolved is the financial crimes, and whether evidence of Murdaugh's financial crimes, can be admitted and used against him in this trial. Murdaugh's attorneys are trying to exclude as much of that as possible. They're saying that, since the state's theory doesn't make sense, the state should not be allowed to just smear their client as a bad guy who deserves to go to jail in the commission of an unrelated crime. So those are two really big outstanding issues that will need to be resolved before this trial can get going in earnest.
Yeah, unrelated crimes for which he has not been convicted yet. So that's
correct.
Another thing, right?
It's fairly well accepted that Murdaugh did steal this money from these people, and he's admitted as much in some of the cases, but he has not been convicted. Correct.
Yeah. So this will be really interesting to see how that goes down. To that, turning to you and Jocelyn recently covered the trial of Russell Lafitte, the former CEO of Palmetto State Bank in Hampton, where Murdaugh is from. He was convicted of helping Murdaugh steal from their clients. You then sifted through thousands of pages of Murdaugh's banking records and other evidence to produce an extremely revealing portrait of his finances. If people haven't read that, I would highly urge you go to it. It's a really interesting read. You sat there for weeks waiting for records and just on the edge of your seat trying to get at those bank ledgers, which I've never seen somebody so excited to go through bank ledgers. But what did you learn from all of this research, and why are his financial dealings expected to play such a pivotal role in this case?
Well, that makes it sound a lot cooler than it was, but I appreciate hyping me up there. Yeah, so one of the things with the Lafitte trial is that a couple of Alex's basically recreations of his bank account ledger were admitted in that case, and parts of them were shown at trial, but we realized, and it took a better part of probably a month and a half to actually get access to them, that there was more than a decade of these records in the case. And what that showed is that, obviously Alex was making a lot of money. One year, he made more than $5 million, according to the indictments, in sort of an unrelated tax evasion charge. The lowest he made, I think, in the last decade was somewhere in the neighborhood of $275,000, which is not $5 million, but I mean, Hampton's like median household income is, I think, $38,000. So
Yes,
I mean, it's
seven
good money.
times less. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, what the records show, and this is an incomplete picture because he had bank accounts outside of Palmetto State Bank, and that's all that we see in these exhibits. But they show this sort of yo-yo effect or roller coaster where so the way PMPED paid its attorneys, most of their pay came at the very end of the year, usually on like New Year's Eve. And that's where they got all of their their cut of the settlements or jury verdicts that they won through the year. So you'll just see like a giant transaction drop in, maybe $1 million, couple $1 million. And what's interesting is then following the transactions that follow that, and how quickly it winnows away. So there's one instance where he gets this bonus check, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it's basically his income, and he's in an overdraft after a week. By January 7th, he's in an overdraft, and a big reason for that was that he had a lot of loans, largely to deal with. I mean, he had his mortgage, he had lines of credit, but he also had these real estate ventures that he was involved in. Some of which are somewhat murky. I haven't seen a lot about what was actually going on, but basically business loans for real estate. And he's making annual payments on them. And so that eats away at the money very quickly. And then as you go through the year, it's sort of, there's a pattern of overdrafts followed by maybe a transfer from a line of credit to cover that. Or in several instances, he borrowed money from a former client, Hannah Plyler, who was, she was at that time a teenager. She'd been in a car wreck that killed her brother and her mother, and she was hurt as well. And anyway, so you see this yo-yo effect, and the financial crimes like that, those loans are sort of the impetus. The theory is that was the impetus for a lot of these financial crimes, is paying back that debt. And then in terms of the murder case, the state's theory is that, as Avery mentioned, that there were a couple of inquiries that were going to force Alex to turn over his books to other attorneys, and that his law firm was sniffing around these missing legal fees. And actually, he was confronted the day of the murders by the CFO at the law firm, who said, "Hey, we need evidence, like we need proof that these legal fees are not missing, that they're actually he had money supposedly in another law firm's trust account, and they wanted evidence of that after going back and forth for 2 months." And that day is the day of the murders. Where I think there's a big gap in our understanding is what happens in the hours between the shootings and that confrontation. Hopefully we'll learn about that at the upcoming trial. But that was a really big reveal from the Lafitte case. And I think it sort of gets to the fact that, or gets to the idea that there's very possibly a link between the financial crimes and this case.
Yeah, so I mean, your story really laid out this case that he had this ravenous need for money. He just needs massive cash infusions. He's getting these checks to cover the overdrafts, almost immediately needs loans that are coming out of different clients' accounts until they don't, right? Until he finds other ways to allegedly stick his hands in the till and plunder client accounts.
Yeah.
On that June 7th date, June 7th of 2021, so he's confronted by the office manager, right, who says, where's this payout that we're supposed to receive? And he's on the spot there. What does he tell her, and how does he sort of slip the noose there?
Yeah, so the confrontation's kind of cut short. And when Jeannie Seckinger, the CFO of the law firm, testified, they didn't get into a ton of detail about this conversation because they weren't there specifically to talk about the murder allegations, right? So that we might get more detail of that in the coming weeks. But basically what happened is the confrontation is cut short because during this meeting, Alex gets a phone call and Jeannie's recollection that his father is about to die. I think he'd been sick for some time, but it was now terminal. And she decided to drop the issue for that moment because it seemed like he needed to go deal with that. And then obviously after the murders, she again dropped it because it was this sort of horrific thing that had happened. And it's not until September that we see sort of a more complete reckoning, I guess, happen at the law firm. And what happens there is in the intervening weeks, Alex manages to come up with money to repay so basically what had happened is he'd had a lawyer he'd worked with, an old friend of his, sent him his cut of the fees directly, where it should have gone to the law firm to be distributed later so that it would go toward their overhead and things like that. And basically he comes up in those intervening weeks with a good chunk of money, not all of the money, to sort of put it back in the other lawyer's account to send to his law firm the way it was supposed to be done in the beginning. Part of that was like a loan from Palmetto State Bank. In any case, so it sort of covers his tracks allegedly well enough. And then a paralegal walks into Alex's office and sees on his desk a check that mentions the legal fees, and it's made out to him. And this is like the original check. And she takes that to the partners of the firm who confront him, I believe, the next day. And then the timeline here is a little tricky, but I believe the day after that is the alleged, like the faked suicide plot.
Yeah, so he basically calls in, says he's been attacked on a roadside in Hampton while changing a tire.
Right.
Next thing you know, he's being shipped off to rehab in Georgia and admitting unspecified mistakes. And then really the case comes apart from there, right? And
yeah.
That's sort of where Jocelyn enters the picture. She was not at the paper when the murders occurred, but was thrust into the case soon after arriving, having to cover his first bond hearing, where he basically comes back from rehab to be accused in this botched suicide plot, which was tied into this alleged insurance fraud scheme to collect on insurance that would go to his eldest son, Buster. That's what the state has said. So that was sort of a little taste, I guess, of the interest that's in this case. You're down in Hampton. Can you set the scene for us a little bit about what you saw that day and what kind of interest that was there in this small town?
Yeah, that was a crazy day. I remember tons of reporters and photographers kind of descended on the town and surrounded this tiny building in Hampton, and neighbors, walked from their homes and stood to kind of observe all the frenzy. And TV crews brought in these massive satellites and put them in the parking lot in front of, where the bond hearing was. And we all, swarmed Murdaugh's defense team anytime we caught a glimpse of them walking in or out of the building. And it's crazy to think how, this same scene might play out in Walterboro, since interest in the case, I think, has only grown since then. We have TV documentary specials, podcasts, book deals. So I think it's just going to be even crazier next week. And we know Walterboro is busy preparing for this massive influx of people that they're planning to get. The town, I think, has a population typically of just over 5,000. And so, we heard that town officials have arranged for food trucks to be parked outside of the courthouse for us to eat, which is very nice of them. And a local law firm is even renting out office space to media who might need a place to work during the trial. So yeah, it'll just be interesting to see how the town continues to cope with all this sudden attention, both during and after the trial's over.
Yeah, and one of our colleagues, Kelly Jean Kelly, was down in Walterboro about a week or so ago and was talking to people there. And in Hampton, there was this sense of fear. I think that the Murdaughs were so powerful, they controlled the local prosecutor's office for 80 plus years. They had this powerful law firm that had made millions suing these deep-pocketed clients down that way. And they were afraid to speak out about it. Walterboro, it's a little bit different scene there. And I think some folks are looking at it as an opportunity to show off the town, to draw in some visitors and economic development. And others, I think, are kind of viewing this as a big unwanted media circus that's going to camp out there for, could be a month or more. Who knows at this point. So you're going to be wading into that. All three of you are traveling down there over the weekend and setting up camp, and it'll be in Walterboro for several weeks. Amidst this giant media scrum, like how are you planning to cover this? I mean, what's our plan?
Yeah, so Judge Newman issued an order recently, which reserves a number of seats in the courtroom for local media, and that was great news for us because we're anticipating, a battle to get one of these seats. It's going to be a lot of people packed into that courtroom. So the Post and Courier has a spot in the courtroom for a reporter and a photographer, which is awesome. And then I know we're planning to have the other two of us in an overflow room that's been designated specifically for media. And that will actually be set up in the town's wildlife center, which is across the street from the courthouse. And the people who are in there are going to be watching the trial live from a closed circuit feed. And then in terms of how we are planning to cover the trial, so I'll be responsible for kind of creating a live feed and pushing out live updates throughout each day of the trial so we can track witnesses and testimony. And it'll be a lot like, I think, what we did in the Lafitte trial. And I hope that helped, break down some of the more complex issues that that case dealt with, which, as Thad mentioned, could easily come up during this trial too. And then we'll also be working with Thad and Avery to identify, some of the bigger themes that emerge throughout the weeks of trial. And of course, also writing a daily recap of, that day's events in the courtroom.
Yeah, we're hoping to bring this all to you through, different medium. I know we're planning on live tweeting it, posting. Jocelyn was amazing during the Lafitte trial and knocking out really good quality live updates, breaking down complex issues into understandable things, and we'll have some good weekenders. Hope to have a little video updates in the morning, and perhaps update our podcast if all goes well on a daily basis. So there's going to be a number of ways you'll be able to access news about the trial. It's probably going to be no hiding from the trial if you're in South Carolina over the next month. So I thought now we might switch to some reader questions that were submitted. And if anybody's got some questions that they haven't asked yet, again, down at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A function, go right ahead and throw some in there, and we'll get to what we can. One question we received is, what role is Curtis Edward Smith expected to play in the trial? For those of you who don't remember, Mr. Smith, no relation, was a former law client of Murdaugh's. He's a distant cousin. He is a disabled logger trucker fellow from Walterboro who was implicated in the botched suicide plot of Labor Day weekend 2021. And he's since been netted in allegations of money laundering and drug running and things of that nature. He's been sitting in the Lexington County Jail for some time. He's been subpoenaed as a witness as well. But some folks don't, the state particularly is not too eager to see him spend a lot on the time on the stand. Avery, could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so earlier in this case a few months ago, he was identified as a potential witness by Murdaugh's lawyers. They said in a motion that the state planned on making Curtis Smith their star witness. That was in the same motion that Murdaugh's lawyers disclosed that Curtis Smith had failed a polygraph test with state investigators back in May. And specifically that deception was detected when Smith was asked whether he shot Maggie or Paul, or whether he was present when Maggie and Paul were killed. Of course, polygraph tests are essentially junk science. They're not reliable, not admissible in court. So all of those caveats obviously should be said. But since then, it's kind of become part of the defense's case to try to shift blame for the murders from their client Murdaugh to potentially anyone else out there, but primarily Curtis Smith, and show that it's possible that the real killer is still out there, as they've said all along. So in response to that, recently the state filed a motion asking Judge Newman to try to limit or to outright prohibit the mentioning of polygraph tests at all during this trial, as well as to prohibit Murdaugh's defense attorneys from trying to blame third parties or introduce evidence of third-party guilt at this trial. So those two motions, which were filed at the same time, seem like a pretty transparent attempt to try to stop Murdaugh's defense attorneys from, turning this trial into a circus and trying to allege that the real killer is Curtis Smith or anyone else, and to try to use that to create doubt within the jury that Murdaugh is the actual killer. So it seems like at this point, neither side really wants Curtis Smith to play a big role at trial. We did learn that he was subpoenaed as a possible witness. We believe that it was the state that subpoenaed him. I don't believe that the defense plans to bring him onto the stand if the state doesn't, but I do believe that the state is that the defense is more than prepared to try to impeach Smith's credibility if he is presented as some sort of star witness against Murdaugh. And they obviously have a lot of material to do that. I mean, Smith is a guy who is charged, as you mentioned, with laundering drugs for Murdaugh, with trafficking drugs and buying drugs for Murdaugh, with laundering millions of dollars that Murdaugh allegedly stole, with shooting Murdaugh in the head during that bizarre Labor Day 2021 incident on the side of the road. He's he is far from the ideal star witness. So I don't necessarily expect him to play a huge role at this trial, but if he does, there will certainly be some fireworks.
Yeah, he by all accounts, I mean, I think he's seen as someone who could be a real wild card on the stand, right? I mean, he could be the perfect foil to throw up there and sow reasonable doubt. And all you need is one, right, on a jury to maybe, but then again, you don't know what else he's going to say when up there. So not a guaranteed home run for either side.
And as prosecutors, you want the focus to be on Alex Murdaugh, his motive, his means, his opportunity. And you don't want it to become a circus. You don't want someone else, to be introduced into the story and into this trial, who could potentially, give the jury reason to doubt. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot that we don't know about this case, a lot that we don't know about the evidence. What we do know has been colored by pretrial motions and press conferences and leaks. So everything we say here has to be caveated and, in the understanding that a lot more is going to come out at trial, and we learn more details about this case every day. But I would be surprised if anyone trots him up to the witness stand.
Yeah, I just a follow up to that too is someone has asked, do you have a sense that there will be significant evidence presented with the murders that the public has not been privy to? Do you think there's going to be any real curveballs coming out here?
Yeah, potentially. Like I said, what we know has been dictated by leaks, and also by the defense's characterization of the state's case, because since the indictment, the state has been very tight-lipped, and so the defense has basically been driving the narrative ever since mid-July of last year. And so they've gone out and said that, the blood spatter and the financial crimes, that's all they have on our client. All this, they've been able to really characterize what the state's case is. So yeah, if they're telling the truth, then there's probably not that much out there that we don't know about. But it isn't necessarily in Murdaugh's defense team's best interest to go out there and tout the state's case, right? So there probably are some things we don't know, but for now, I do think we know a good bit about the state's case in terms of what evidence they have and what the defense's responses to those pieces of evidence are going to be.
Dad, I see you're typing an answer there, but I did want to put you on the spot with the same question.
Yeah,
Reader asks, how do you think the jury selection will go? What will the attorneys look for with the jury, especially given how high profile this case is? That's a great question, because
it's a very good
it's going to be
question.
hard to find people in that area that haven't heard of this case. Now, knowing what you know about the Lafitte case going in, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was going to say, Lauren, it's a good question. I'm actually working on a story about it right now, so keep an eye out for that in the next couple of days. Probably coming out Monday. To go along with the start of jury selection. But yeah, I think basically, I'll say, first of all, I was surprised in the Lafitte case how quickly jury selection moved. I think if I remember right, they had their panel by lunchtime on the first day. Now, granted, so we weren't able to see the jury selection process. We were kicked out in a sort of awkward moment in the courtroom. Or I was kicked out of the courtroom. But I looked back at the transcript of what happened during that process later. And part of how they were able to seat a jury so quickly is that, they asked, okay, who's heard of the Murdaugh case? It was a more detailed question than that, but they asked that question, and half the prospective jurors stood up, it looks like. The way they were able to basically seat a jury is that many people who had heard of the case hadn't heard of the banking aspect of it. They were like, oh, isn't that the thing with the murder, I was surprised. There were a lot of people who just hadn't gotten that deep into following the case. There's one person who said, oh yeah, I saw some headlines about that, but I hit the paywall and I didn't want to pay for it, so I didn't. There's another person who said, yeah, I watched half a documentary only because my mom had it on when I got home, and I just sat and watched the last half. So it's interesting. One person was like, I'm too busy at work to really keep up, but I've heard of it. So I think probably, if I were to guess, neither side is going to talk about their jury selection strategy. But I think what they're going to be looking for is people who everyone's going to have heard of the case. So people who just haven't gotten that deep into it, maybe they're just not following all the podcasts and documentaries and news coverage, and people who just sort of at least have a sense of ambiguity about what happened. Obviously, if somebody goes up and says, I think he for sure did it, they're going to get struck. But people who maybe are sort of familiar with it, but not super familiar with it, I think is probably what your target's going to be. But to your question about how it's going to go, they're clearly expecting it to be sort of tricky. The latest I heard from the clerk of court's office is that they sent jury summonses to 900 people, which is crazy. The Susan Smith murder case in '95, I was looking at some clips on this. They sent summonses to 250 people, and that was a huge trial at the time too. For context, that's 1 in 30-ish people in Colleton County. So it's a really big pool that they're drawing. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I'm guessing it'll be at least a few days.
Yeah, there was a question too, and there've been a lot of discussion early on as to whether they would try to move this trial to another jurisdiction, or possibly, bus in jurors from another part of the state, and they haven't done either, right? And there was a lot of concern because, again, the Murdaughs, beginning in was it 1920, they served as the chief prosecutor for that region in the very judicial circuit that's trying him now. And what his grandfather, Buster, his portrait was hanging in the courtroom during several of the proceedings, and the judge ordered it to come down before the trial starts. Anyone with any insight as to, I don't think either side made a motion, right, to try to move it outside that area?
Correct. Nobody requested it, and judges don't just change the venue on their own. There typically has to be some sort of motion from either the defense or the state, typically, one side or the other, to either bring the trial to a completely different venue, a different county, or to bring in jurors from a different county and still hold the trial in Colleton County. Don't really have a lot of insight as to why neither side did that. But I do think that there's still a lot we don't know about how the Murdaugh name is perceived in that neck of the woods. We've heard a lot about people who love the Murdaughs and would do anything for them. People who owed the Murdaughs favors from, favors that the Murdaughs had done for them. People who feared the Murdaughs and knew that they were people you didn't want to cross. But, since all of this has come out, since Alex Murdaugh has been stuck in the jail since last October, and, the whole family mystique has kind of come crashing down, we don't know. I'm sure the attorneys on each side have probably done focus groups and maybe some polling, but we don't know how the family name is perceived down there. And I think that's going to be a real X factor in this trial that we're not really going to fully understand, maybe ever, but certainly not until the jury verdict comes in. So that's a long way of saying we don't know the answer to your question, but that is what, that is our understanding of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people had expected that, somebody was going to try to move this somewhere or get a different jury pool in. It just never happened. And like you say, that is such a big X factor because it could cut either way, right?
Yeah, it could. And, I think that may play a role in jury selection as well. Like Thad said, it's going to depend on people's preconceived notions, about the Murdaughs. It's going to depend on if anyone out there has possibly avoided all of the publicity that's been going on over the past, 2 years. And one thing that I was speaking to a trial lawyer the other day, and he was telling me that it's kind of harder than ever to pick in this climate, in this political atmosphere, an impartial jury, because people have got their minds made up about everything. They've got greater access to information and news and analysis and opinion than ever before because of the internet and technology. And so it's really hard to find 12 open-minded people who have not already, whether they'll admit it or not during jury selection, have not already made up their mind about an issue or a person or a crime. So again, I think the jury is by far going to be the greatest X factor in this.
Yeah, not to mention all the people, as one of the viewers pointed out, that probably knew them personally in some respect. It's a pretty tight-knit area, not a ton of people. Had a few questions too from people, and it's that same question that I guess we've all been asking for the last year and a half too, is where did all the money go? Why did he need so much money? Thad, you spoke a little bit about the busted real estate deals, and in the beginning, clearly the indication was that he had this raging opioid habit and needed to feed this drug frenzy of his. But I mean, the amount of money that was passing through, I mean, you could probably buy like a fentanyl factory in China or something with that. So I mean, where anyone outside of the drugs and real estate, where did all that money go?
Yeah, no, Martha, I see that question. I think it's kind of like the $1 million question to me in this case. I mean, granted, I'm sort of more focused on the financial crimes at this point. Honestly, looking through his bank records, like I'm not a forensic accountant or anything, but I still am not sure. There's a lot of cash transactions. Certainly some of that, or probably a good chunk of that, could be going toward drugs. But I think that's an unknown still. I will say, like the real estate deals do appear to be very large, but there's also like a sort of a dynamic there where one of his main business partners died. I forget exactly when, but in the 2010s. So I think that also shifted some of the financial responsibility for those deals. But yeah, I think there's a ton of money that's unaccounted for, at least to my mind. I'm hoping to get I'm hoping we get some answers about that in the next few weeks. Because I will say, like, sitting through the Lafitte trial, which took like basically 3 weeks, that was the question that just like kept being like on the tip of everyone's tongues, and it just there wasn't a clear resolution to it. So I'm kind of in the same boat as you, is what I would say.
Yeah, and I mean we're all talking about this the other day, and how the economy in South Carolina and some of the areas at least that he was investing was kind of booming, right? I mean, real estate is going through the roof, rental prices, housing prices, and how do you fail at real estate, I guess, in this economy now? But some of the land, right? It's kind of swampy.
Yeah, I mean, there was
land.
one deal. This is mentioned in the story. It was a proposed like subdivision development outside of Beaufort, kind of closer to Bluffton, or that way. And in that case, there was a lot of opposition to it on environmental grounds, sort of developing this island. And that property ended up becoming, it's now preserved, essentially. The county bought it. So I don't know the specific dynamics. And there's a couple of the deals, like in Berkeley County, that like there was a fair amount of reporting on this Beaufort deal in the Island Packet at the time. I have not seen so much about the Berkeley proposal, so I don't know all the details of what they were trying to do there. That's sort of an unknown that is sort of on my list to chip away at. But yeah, it's a good question.
I'll throw one last one out there, and I know we're kind of running out of time. A couple of people have asked too. Curious as to, were there any indications that Maggie or Paul were aware of the financial problems, were aware of the drug problems? I know there's been suggestions throughout this case that she was perhaps pursuing some sort of consulting about a divorce, but there's been no evidence brought forward to show that that's the case. I mean, that's been talked about since week one, right? And no one's ever come forward and said, here's the attorney, here's what she was doing, or any sort of paperwork on that.
That's a great question. Like you said, there have been reports, rumors. People magazine, for example, wrote in an account that Murdaugh's attorneys hotly disputed that Maggie was living apart from Murdaugh, living at the family's Edisto Beach house, and also was meeting with a divorce attorney in the weeks before she was killed. Since then, Murdaugh's attorneys have said they've gone through all the texts between Alec and Maggie, and it only shows a loving relationship between a husband and wife, no evidence of marital strife or anything like that. They said they have no evidence or any indication that she ever met with the defense attorney. And they also said that the reason that Maggie had been living for the past months, almost a year, at the Edisto house was because of the stigma that she felt had attached to the family in the wake of the 2019 boat crash around Hampton. So, she was living there while working on renovations to that house, they say, basically as a way to avoid that feeling of uncomfortability she was feeling in Hampton. And a big part of what Murdaugh's defense team is saying in an effort to to try to take out or to try to dismiss the state's theory of the case is that there is no linkage between the financial crimes and all of the inquiries that were supposedly about to expose them before the murders, and Alec Murdaugh deciding to kill his wife and son. There's no confrontation, where Maggie or Paul found out about the financial crimes and then brought them to Alec's attention or threatened to expose them. But they've said that is not in the state's case. Again, that's the defense characterizing the state's case. But in that hearing where that was said, Creighton Waters, the state prosecutor, did not get up and say, actually, we do have that evidence. He didn't say anything to rebuff what Murdaugh's attorneys were saying. So that is, that link there between the financial crimes and them about to be exposed, and Murdaugh actually allegedly picking up a gun or two guns and killing his wife and son. That's something that we don't really have quite yet, or we don't know if it exists. So it'll be interesting to see if that does exist, if that does come out at trial, and if it doesn't, how does the state make that sort of logical leap and get the jury to follow them on that logical leap and convincing them that the financial crimes were enough to convince someone to kill two of their relatives.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, and so I'm sure we're going to learn a whole lot more about this in the days and weeks to come. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Encourage you again, if you want to get caught up on the case, go to postandcourier.com/Murdaugh, or check out our podcast, Understand Murdaugh. Come Monday morning, be sure to tune in early to Jocelyn, because she's going to be pumping out those live updates that'll really keep you abreast of the latest developments in the case. Remember also that you can sign up for any of our newsletters, which are free at postandcourier.com/newsletter sign up. And if you're a subscriber, we'd like to say thank you. If you're not a subscriber, you can sign up at postandcourier.com/subscribe. I want to thank everyone and our panelists today. And again, have a great day, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.